Hi guys, how are you? All right, well it's 9 o'clock on my end, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Today we are supposed to be doing our presentations where you guys are going to tell me about your marine animal that you created for homework. Now, unfortunately, I went into Moodle and I could not find any assignments that were sent in. So, and DeAndre Paul, maybe you guys kept it and we're going to share it on video. Does anyone have a picture or would like to share a description of their marine animal with us? If you do, just go ahead and raise your hand. All right, well, if you don't have one to share with us today, if you could go ahead and email it to me, that would be fantastic. Anne seems to be having a little bit of trouble, so we're going to give her a second. While we are giving her a second, I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me. So if you could just go ahead and answer yes or no for can you hear me? Perfect. DeAndre can hear. Paul. Awesome. Now we're just waiting for Anne. Great. Okay, well then if no one has a project to share with us, that's fine. We are going to go ahead and get started with class. Now today in class, you guys had voted to work on the beach. So we are going to look at a couple of different types of areas or smaller ecosystems on the beach. So if you could go ahead and look at your whiteboards. I'm going to write a couple of things up here for us to brainstorm about. And we are going to think about the zones or areas of a beach. Now, we're going to start up high. So we're going to start with the area that's closest inland, closest to the shore. Now, this is called the splash zone. Next comes the high tide zone, then the low tide zone, and then the subtidal zone. That's the area. So if you were to have a beach that would look like this, and here is our water. Not purple water, we need blue water. This would be our water line right about here. So, the subtidal zone is below the water. The low tide zone is the area where when it is a low tide, it is exposed. When it is high tide, it is covered by water. The high tide zone is the area right where the high tide meets. And the splash zone is the area that just gets splashes of water. So what I want to know are some animals that you guys think may live in some of these different zones. So we have the splash zone at the bottom. We have our low tide zone. We have our high tide zone. And we have our splash zone. Now I'm going to go ahead and get us started with an example of each. So in our splash zone, we are going to have some grasses. In our high tide zone, we may have some snails. In our low tide zone, we may have some crabs. Oops, and this is our subtidal zone. And in our subtidal zone, we may have pufferfish. Now, there are animals that will overlap into more than one of these zones. What I want you guys to do is spend a couple of minutes and try to guess what animals exist at what parts and in which zones on the beach. So go ahead and write them up on the whiteboard for us. All right, let's go add a few more up here, guys. I know you can think of some. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at what you guys have up here and what animals you think are where in the beach ecosystem. So right now we have in the splash zone grasses, rocks, and clams. All of those can be found in the splash zone. Good job. In the high tide zone we have snails and sea turtles. Good job. The low tide zone, horseshoe crabs, small bony fish and crabs. Great job. Subtidal zone, we have pufferfish, seahorses, and sand dollars. Fantastic. Well, we are going to go ahead and look at a PowerPoint now about the different zones of the beach. So let's take a look at life in the tidal zone. Tidal habitats are a great place to live. There are high levels of primary food production, which means there are lots of food and different types of food in tidal habitats. Now, if you were to look outside your window right now, you probably will see some sort of organism that uses photosynthesis, whether it's grass, whether it's trees, whether it's a flower garden. In the ocean, we don't have plants that use photosynthesis as our main food source. What we have are phytoplankton that use photosynthesis. The tidal habitats are very nutrient-rich waters. They're created from river drainage into the sea and upwelling. Upwelling is when the cold water from the bottom of the sea comes up and replaces the warmer water on the surface, which goes down. And it creates these circular patterns in the water, which allows the organisms like phytoplankton and zooplankton that are kind of just floating in the water to circulate all in the water column, all up and down. So here we have some special tidal zone adaptations, special things that helps organisms that live in the tidal zone. Tidal habitats change daily with the tides, so organisms have to adapt or adjust to changing environmental conditions. There's a couple of features we are going to look at that animals use to do this. The first one is if an animal is attached to a rock, and sometimes that rock is underwater when it's high tide, and sometimes that rock is above water when it's low tide, the animals need to be able to avoid drying out. So for example, here I put some limpets. Limpets shape their shell to fit a specific rock. They figure out where they are going to be, and what they do is they can seal the shell tight to the rock. And this effectively seals against water loss. Basically, they form a suction cup, just like you might stick a picture to your window with a suction cup. They stick their shell to the rock like a suction cup so they do not dry out. We have starfish or sea stars. And sea stars, if you look at the picture on the top right here, you can see what look like little hairs reaching out of the sea star's arm. Well, those aren't hairs, those are tube feet. The tube feet are used to move or to walk around the ocean floor, the rock, the beach, or to suction themselves to a rock so they stay still, so they don't get washed away by a wave. Now these organisms also need to protect themselves. So on the bottom we have a picture of a hermit crab. The hermit crab is hiding in a shell. That's what it uses for protection. If something comes and is seen as dangerous, the hermit crab will curl up right inside of his little or big shell. There are also pipefish. Pipefish are a very thin, greeny, browny color, and they camouflage very well in eelgrass. Can anyone think of another animal that we might see in a tidal zone and how it uses either one of these adaptations here or a different adaptation to protect itself? Go ahead and just turn your mic on and let us know, or text it in the text chat. Can anyone come up with another idea? How about a snail? How might a snail either protect itself or adapt in another way in a tidal zone? Is anyone here, or am I talking to myself? How might a snail protect itself or have another adaptation or another animal?
A turtle.
All right, perfect. A turtle definitely has some special adaptations that it uses to protect itself. Now, if we think back to sea turtles, and when we talked about them, we said that they had a hard shell, but we gave that shell a special name. We called it a carapace. That carapace protects the sea turtle from predators. Great job, Paul. Thank you very much. Anyone else? The snail, Anne wrote into the text chat, protects itself with its shell, just like the hermit crab. Great job. Can you think of any other animals in the tidal zone? Remember, this includes animals that are up in the splash zone and all the way down into the subtidal zone. Anyone think of any other animal adaptations? All right, well then let's look at two different types of tidal habitats. Does anyone want to read this slide for me? Go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like to volunteer to read. Alrighty then. There are two main different types of tidal habitats. The first is the picture on the left. On the left, you see a sandy beach and a mud flat. And the second is your picture on the right, which are rocky shores. Now, let's come up with a couple of different characteristics. Go ahead and tell me what are some characteristics that you see of the sandy beach. You can go ahead and turn your mic on or put it in the text chat. What are some characteristics of a sandy beach? Go ahead, DeAndre.
It has sand, trees, lots of nutrients, trees, of course turtles. Sometimes it can be windy. Of course, the ocean with a lot of animals come out of it, like horseshoe crabs, and that's it. About it.
Great job. Those were some great characteristics of a sandy beach. Good job. And then Anne added one into the text chat that said there are lots of nutrients. Great job coming up with some characteristics, guys. Now how about rocky shores? Take a look at the picture. What are some characteristics of rocky shores? Rocky shores. Just take a look. DeAndre had some great characteristics of sandy beaches and mudflats. Take a look at this picture of the rocky shore and come up with a couple of characteristics. Go ahead, Anne.
I've seen lots of rocky shores, and specifically when I got an opportunity to go to the Galapagos Islands, and the shore, besides from having fishes that had adaptations to live on really small puddles, like if you can look through the rocks, or little tiny quantities of water where they can live, but they have other types of animals roaming around, like black iguanas and stuff like that that also swim in the ocean hunting for fish. And that was quite interesting. I thought I could share.
Awesome, great job. Well, rocky shores do have a lot of little tide pools, like Anne said, little areas of water in between the rocks where the water kind of catches, and then that little tide pool becomes separated from the rest of the ocean until the tide comes back in. So these are changing every single high and low tide, and they are their own little ecosystem. One time they may have some starfish in it, the next tide they may have crabs in it, and the next tide that same little tide pool may not even be there. So let's look at what I had written for sandy beaches. I have that the substrate, which is the sand or the mud, offers lots of nutrients, but little structure for attachment. You're not going to find a lot of seaweed or sea stars or mussels, things that need to attach to something on a sandy beach or a mud flat. There's just nothing to hold on to. Here, what the animals do is they bury themselves in the mud or the sand, like a clam. A clam will bury itself in the mud or the sand. A lot of different worms will bury themselves for protection. That is their adaptation. And then I also wrote here they can attach to plants. There are snails that like to attach to plants in order to protect themselves. And if we look at the rocky shore on the right, we have there is little protection from strong waves. So the animals must anchor themselves. A lot of times, if you have a rock in a rocky shore, the animals will be all attached to the side of the rock that is closest to the beach, because this usually provides more protection from the strong waves. There are complex tide pools possible, like I just explained, and the seaweed offers protection from drying. So animals that don't want to dry out, like let's say a crab, if he crawls up underneath a piece of moist seaweed, the seaweed will stay wet until the next high tide and help protect the crab from drying out. So here we have a picture of our tidal zones. Oh, and it looks like one of my pictures did not load on the bottom there. So tidal habitats are divided into zones based on their beach location and how often they are covered by water. Splash zones are the area of the beach that is not usually covered by any water. But if it's really windy, some of the salt water will go up and splash it, or it is very close to the beach, so if there's a storm, the water will go up to that area. The high tide zone is the area when it is high tide that is underwater. The middle tide zone is the area that is underwater from halfway low tide to high tide. And the low tide zone is the area where the low tide water line is. Usually the low tide zone is covered by water. The subtidal zone, which there's no picture here unfortunately, is the area that is always covered by water. Now on the right-hand side here, I wrote intertidal zone. If you were to call something the intertidal zone of the beach, what scientists are referring to is the zone that's affected daily by changing tides. So the area between high tide and low tide. Animals who live in this area need to be able to adapt the most. So let's look at some characteristics and animals that live in each of these areas. The splash zone is high on the beach. It is out of the water most of the time. The species that live here must tolerate salt, heat, cold, and extended dry periods. There's low diversity. Does anyone know what low diversity means? If an ecosystem has a low diversity, that means that there are very few different types of animals that live in that area. So here are some animals that live in the splash zone. We have lichens growing on trees. Isopods in the middle, which kind of look like little bugs. Blue-green algae. We have amphipods and periwinkles. Other animals that come into the splash zone are animals like raccoons or deer, female sea turtles when they are laying their eggs, rats, and lots of different types of birds. Those are all organisms that can live in the splash zone. As we move down the beach, our next zone is the high tide zone. Anyone want to volunteer to read this slide for me? All right, in the high tide zone, we have increased wave action. The species or organisms who live here must be able to survive exposure to drying out. There are tide pools, like we talked about, that provide some protection. And there is a higher diversity of animals, including some animals from splash zones and the middle zones in the tide pools. And here are some animals that live in the high tide zone. Limpets, who, like we said, make that suction cup with their shell to avoid drying out. We have crabs on the bottom. We have a green crab picture there. We have rockweed, which is a type of seaweed, over on the right. And then on the top right, we have barnacles. The barnacles eat and feed when it's high tide and they're covered by water. And when it's low tide, they close up, like the picture right here, to protect themselves from drying out. Next, we have the most active region of our beach, and that is the middle tide zone. The middle tide zone is covered and uncovered twice a day. Animals or organisms who live here must be able to tolerate both submersion and exposure to air. The animals move in and out of the adjacent zones to feed here. So let's take a look at some of these animals. On the top, we have a wrinkled whelk. Whelks are organisms that like to live in this area. We have anemones. We have sea stars, and I put a purple one and an ochre one up here. And we have blue mussels. The next tidal zone is our low tide zone. Our low tide zone is our most diverse zone. There are more plants and animals in the low tide zone than in all the other zones combined. This zone also has the most food and shelter. There is less exposure to air and heat. And the animals in this tide zone, some of them, are unable to exist in other tide zones. And the subtidal zone is the area just below the intertidal zone. It is almost never exposed to the air. There are many consumer animals here that prey on animals in low tide zones. Life forms here are less tolerant to changes. They do not have adaptations that allow them to survive without water. Organisms in this tide zone are different types of fish and invertebrates like wolf eels, jellyfish, and octopus. Now, if you look at the octopus here, I put a couple of different pictures so you could see and compare. The top octopus has a lot of skin flap between his arms. The bottom octopus does not. The top octopus can move more quickly because he has more push when he pushes. Now the other picture of the octopus here is a picture of the suckers on the bottom of his arms. Similar to the starfish, or sea star, so that he can hold onto things and move around. Now, if you wanted to summarize the tidal zones, you could do so using a triangle and a kite. If you drew a triangle and then listed the areas of the tidal zones from highest up the beach to lowest, you could have a triangle with one of exposure to water. The least exposure is at the splash zone. The most exposure is in the subtidal zone. And with diversity, you have the most diverse at the main part of our kite, which is at the low tide zone. Okay, how many people here have ever been to a beach? Oh. Okay, all of you have been to a beach. So we are going to do a little task here. I'm going to give you each a square. And what I would like you to do, and we're going to have Paul's, DeAndre, and Ann. And I would like you to describe the beach to me. Characteristics of it, animals you saw, and the weather. Was it hot, cold, tropical, polar? Go ahead and take a couple of minutes to do this, and then we are going to try to characterize our beach. All right, give me some more characteristics. You guys are doing awesome. Try to be as specific as you can. Okay, I'm going to give you 2 more minutes to finish up, so finish whichever one you are working on. And then we are going to try and characterize our beach. All right, so here's how this is going to work. You each have put some characteristics up here. Now we are going to break up our beach into 3 sections. Okay, here we go. We have our splash zone. We have our intertidal zone, which is the high tide, middle, and low tide zone. And then we are doing our subtidal zone. I want you to take any of your organisms, and I would like you to put them into the correct zone. Now remember, some are going to overlap, so go ahead and put them in the zone you saw them in if the organism overlaps. So for example, if on my list I had dolphin, he would be in a subtidal zone. And if I had a green crab, he would be here in the intertidal zone. And if I had a seagull, he's going to go here in my splash zone. So go ahead and put your organisms in the correct zone. All right, you guys are doing great. All right, fantastic. A lot of the organisms that you guys had could actually go in more than one of these categories, like for example, clams could go in subtitle or intertitle. The small fish and the small sharks could stay in intertitle, or they could go to subtitle. The horseshoe crab could go in subtitle, or all the way into the splash zone. So the organisms on the beach are all very, very connected to each other. And even though the beach may seem like one huge ecosystem, there are very definite characteristics of these different zones of a beach. Now, what I always like to do is two things to end one of my courses. Now, the first thing I like to do is to tell you guys a little bit about how you would successfully become a marine biologist. Okay, so let's see if you were going to, and I'm going to put these up on the whiteboard here, and let's come up with some ways how to become a marine biologist. Well, this class probably gave you an idea, whether it's good or bad, of whether you would like to become a marine biologist, or at least think about becoming a marine biologist. So if you decided, I really like this, I think this is what I want to do. Some things to become a marine biologist is you need to be strong in science and math. Lots of marine biologists also use computer modeling when they are trying to determine trends about animals or tracking animals. So computer skills are a definite plus. Marine biologists need to go to school, need to go to college. Most have masters or PhDs. However, there are some that do not. Most marine biologists specialize in a specific field. For example, they may specialize in shark research, or they may specialize in dolphin research. Some marine biologists who specialize in dolphin research may be studying college psychology. Some majors would include marine biology, psychology, marine science, chemical oceanography, physical oceanography. A chemical oceanographer is going to look at what water is made up of, whereas a physical oceanographer is going to look at what the ocean floor is made up of and how currents move around the ocean. Okay, but the most important thing to becoming a marine biologist or anything that you want to be when you quote unquote grow up is to work hard towards your goal. And if you work hard and you put in the time and the effort, hopefully you will succeed and become whatever you would like to be. The other thing I like to do when I end my courses is to figure out what you guys enjoyed and what you did not enjoy. Now, when we do this, I'm going to remind you guys that I cannot see who is writing what on the whiteboard. Whatever you write up here is completely anonymous. There's no way for me to figure it out. In this first box, I would like you to write what you liked. In the second box, I would like you to write what you did not like. And in the third box, if there's something you would add, write that. Now, I do not want you to write, did not like the homework. Homework is part of school. We can't change that. So if you guys could go ahead and take a second and fill in a couple of comments in these boxes for me, that would be fantastic. All right, if you can think of anything, that would be fantastic. All right, thank you guys very much for taking a minute and going ahead and filling those out for me. This was our last class, so what's going to happen now is I am going to go ahead and finish grading anything that was submitted late in Moodle. I will go ahead and send you a link to a certificate. If you attended at least 60% of the classes, you will pass the class. You will get a certificate. I will let your advisor know that you finished the class so that they will know as well. And they can add it on to your report card. You can print your certificate. It's just going to be a certificate of completion for marine biology. If you would like to sign up for any other learning labs, session 2 starts the first week of January, and I believe session 3 starts the second week of March. Just to give you guys an idea of when things start and when things run, my suggestion would be to sign up for the courses sooner rather than later, as